Today we are going to take a look at Francis Bacon, one of the main instigators of what we call the scientific revolution. He lived from 1561 to 1626. He was a very important man in the political life of England. He was born of a father who was a chief counselor of Queen Elizabeth. He himself served as a liberal-minded member of Parliament under the Queen. And under James I, he actually had a real role to play in the colonization of North America by England, and he was elevated into the peerage as a Lord Verulam, a member of the House of Lords, and eventually rose to become Lord Chancellor in 1618. In 1621, he was further ennobled to become a Viscount, but then a few months later he was cast down from power, charged with bribery, whether or not that was a just thing or not, or a matter of political intrigue. This, in fact, gave him the time to work, the leisure to work on his literary and philosophical writings. And so this is, in a way, a great gift. So he was known in his life as a great politician, but in fact, his legacy for the world is in his scientific theorizing. He was known to reject the Aristotelianism that was regnant in the university still, and this is kind of something we have to wrap our minds around, because in fact the humanists we've looked at, they tended to want to take Plato on, in particular, Marsilio Ficino for instance, but however much Plato gained ground with some of the leading thinkers of the Renaissance, Aristotle still held sway in the universities. So that's important to keep in mind. And so Aristotelian scholasticism was still setting the table. But in any case, we want to think of, and we have to think about how it is that Aristotle was going to be looked at after the Renaissance as opposed to before. There are many Renaissances. If you kind of look at the history of Europe, we've talked about the Carolingian, but we've also mentioned in the past the 12th century Renaissance, so-called, where the Greek works were finally reclaimed for Western Europe through, especially Andalusia, that is through Islamic Iberia, and that really got the High Middle Ages going intellectually. It was a very decisive moment. So this Greek learning in these massive quantities is coming through the Arab world into Europe, and it one might be able to see the beginning of modernity, as it were, even in the beginning in the High Middle Ages. That is, there's this momentum that's building throughout the 13th century with Aquinas and Bonaventure and so on, and the very fecund kind of conflict between Aristotelians and Augustinians in the universities. But then, of course, Europe hits the wall with famine and then the Black Death. You have at least a century after 1347 of massive depopulation, obviously, and then, of course, depression, economic depression. Around 1460, population starts to increase again, and leading up all the way to 1600, maybe half of the population grows by half more, so not quite recovering from the great devastation of the bubonic plague, but getting there. And there's a great economic expansion that goes along with this. So we might see a continuity that if it hadn't been for that great setback of the crisis of the 14th century, which had other aspects, the 100 Years' War, the papal scandals, and so on. And then, so things are starting to recover, but then things get derailed again with the wars that follow upon the Reformation. So the path to modernity is a very rocky one. And that kind of explains why it takes so many centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire to get anything like the same level of material culture again. It's not because there's some kind of backwardness, it's because the forces that are leading to revitalization, including the rediscovery of Greek learning, they keep hitting very significant, demographic challenges, which usually are the most basic ones. In the excitement, the intellectual ferment of these early modern days, which overlap with the Renaissance and the late medieval period, what is being done, the beginning of the scientific revolution, is not really, the word scientist, the way we mean it, wasn't coined till used that way till the 19th century. It comes from the Latin scientia, which is based in episteme, but scientia, science, is to have knowledge. And the term for the thinkers at this point who are on the leading edge of gathering knowledge in a way that's recognizable to us as science, they called it natural philosophy, which is kind of very important to keep in mind. It wasn't this thing that technicians did somewhere else. This is what the thinkers of the time did, natural philosophy. You were open, you were excited by all of the new things that could be learned. And of course, this spirit was very much fed by and fed into the voyages of discovery. This is all part of that shift away, the center of gravity of Europe going from the Mediterranean cultures across the Alps into the northern and western European nations, because the Ottoman Turks had closed off much of the Mediterranean trade. What was still there, the trade from the east, because people really wanted the spices. You could, for the Moluccas, for instance, the cinnamon and the cloves and peppers from India and so on. These are very important for the diet, especially of the wealthy, and this is where you had any kind of monetary commerce was from the east, the Far East, where the Ottomans and that new form of a Turkish takeover of the Islamic world, where that was, and they were very aggressive, and they're the ones, of course, who brought down the Rome, what was left of Rome in Constantinople in 1453. So that made Mediterranean trade tricky, but whatever was left of that trade was still run by the Italians. So the growing powers in the West were looking for other ways to get in on this trade, and that's why that little Iberian country of Portugal starts the whole ball rolling by sending out voyages that would creep down the coast of Africa, surpassing anything the Romans had done, and eventually, in 1487, Diaz gets to the Cape of Good Hope. So they find out that Africa does have an end. You can get around it. A decade later, Vasco da Gama takes a trading fleet and actually gets all the way to India. So Portugal's too small to conquer peoples along the way. They set up trading posts. That's how they do it. And they really cut into the spice trade. Spain isn't going to be able to challenge them on that path. So Columbus goes to Ferdinand and Isabella and asks to try out his theory that the Earth is really smaller than people think. People didn't think it was flat, but people did. And people did think, based on the Greek calculations, that in fact the Earth was very large. Columbus thought it was smaller, so he thought, well, I'm going to sail the other direction and get to the Far East that way. He, in fact, of course, finds a new world, and that's new to the Europeans, of course, not new to the ones who were there. But it was a very sparsely populated, huge landmass, and this, if you can imagine what this would do to the European imagination to find out, or actually the imagination of anybody in the old world, Chinese or whatever, everybody, to find that there's these massive territories of something that people didn't know about who weren't there. So that was another stimulus to thinking beyond what had always been the case. So this is all part of the background of what we call the scientific revolution, which has determined our lives probably more fundamentally than any other revolution. I mean, it feeds into the industrial revolution and these two, and then on into the digital revolution. These are the things that shape our daily life because they change the material culture of our lives. So, and often Bacon, from more conservative critics, will get criticized for taking us out of a kind of search for wisdom and getting us thinking about productivity. And some of those criticisms might be well taken, but we need to see that, in fact, just like other thinkers of the early modern period, this natural philosopher, Francis Bacon, was a devout Christian, so he's a devout Anglican. He did criticize the theologians especially, the other scholastic types for too much theorizing and not enough doing. But in this, we should remember we're hearing a lot of the humanist talk, right? When Erasmus says we need a philosophia Christi, that is an emphasis on changing one's life and not getting the fine points of dogma down. Well, there's something that's very congruent here, something we would later maybe call the primacy of the practical, the primacy of the ethical. Something about that we saw with the growth of lay piety, that the point isn't to get to surrender to a learned class, this monopoly on a very abstruse set of doctrines, but in fact, what does it mean to be a Christian, for instance? For this is a question really these people were thinking, including the early scientists. What does it mean to take this seriously? Well, for Bacon, that meant you have to live out charity, actually. So we think of him in terms of knowledge, power, right? That you have knowledge so you can control the world. Well, that is, and he is right there at that immense juncture in the history of the world. But for him, it's just part of this great wave, which is modern, right? To not let a little class monopolize knowledge, but in fact to make knowledge serve the relief of man's estate, as he says. So the whole quote that comes from is, knowledge is the rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. That is, to make people's lives concretely better. That was his concern. Now, there's difficulties here because the Catholic Church both was a part of the new learning, but of course, at times, could retard it. Copernicus was a canon of the Catholic Church, and it was his version of heliocentrism that really changed everything. So around 1514, he came up with this man in holy orders, trying to make sense of the data, which he would only publish in 1543, and actually through the auspices of Luther's lieutenant Melanchthon, which is fascinating. There's a lot of interesting overlap here. But so the geocentric model that had Earth at the center was a combination of the Greek thinkers, two and different approaches. Plato was convinced in that Pythagorean way that circular motion is perfect. And so you look up at the stars, and they could look up at the ancients, the medievals, the early moderns. They could look up at the stars much more easily than we can. They didn't have all the light pollution, so they lived with the stars. They lived, and they could feel. If you've ever gone out into a really dark place like San Vice and Acadia or something like that, and you can there's an influence you can kind of feel, right? It's not like this is all crazy, because they still believed in astrology. The early modern scientists, quote unquote, still believed in astrology, and we had to take. I mean, we can look down on people, but we say, well, there are these connections in the world that we don't quite understand, right? Why is a woman's menstrual cycle related to the lunar phase? I mean, that's interesting. So Plato thought, well, these stars that are up there, they're so perfect, and so they must move in a circular manner because circular motion is perfect. Aristotle had a different emphasis. He says things fall because they're going to the center of the earth. The earth itself must fall to the center because it's the heaviest thing. So that's why Aristotle has the earth at the center. And center doesn't mean that we're the center of the world. It means that we're the lowest thing in the world. The highest thing is on the outside and the highest. So that it's a mistake to think that the geocentric model was somehow kind of narcissistic. It really isn't understanding the point here. The problem is the data didn't match this. I mean, eventually we could only work out the fact that you can't predict planetary motion without understanding they're ellipses, not circles. So that was a problem for the Platonic commitment. And we could tell, and even Ptolemy, that great thinker in the early, from 90 to 168, he was taking the Platonic and Aristotelian, trying to make it into a system, make it work, and he had a very elegant, very complex system to try to make the observed motions of the planets and stars fit these theoretical pre-commitments. he had to make the Earth slightly off-center to, say, account for the unequal length of the seasons. So, I mean, it worked to predict, to give us astrological tables, for instance, but it also didn't make sense with regard to his Aristotelianism, because, in fact, the Earth shouldn't be off-center, it should be center. So there were these problems. Copernicus had his own theory. He said, put the sun at the center and that'll work a lot of this out. It didn't work everything out, but it works a lot of things out. Well, Galileo, he comes along, he advocates Copernicanism, and he gets in trouble with the church. One of the popes sends even Cardinal Bellarmine, a very brilliant theologian, to silence Galileo. Galileo has said you can't advance heliocentrism. And this is sad. I mean, the next pope actually is a friend of Galileo's. He's interested in these questions. But Galileo, a following pope, is still not happy when Galileo comes out with a dialogue that implies, in fact, that geocentrism is a stupid position. So Galileo is called before the Inquisition. Again, he is found to be guilty, and he's imprisoned. Eventually, it's house arrest. And, of course, that legend is he was forced to recant, to say that heliocentrism isn't true. And the legend is that he said, "Eppur si muove," and still it moves, right? That the Earth is still actually moving. Okay, well that's the tortured relationship, but in fact, of course, the advance of knowledge comes out of a religious matrix, including many Catholic scientists many Catholic clerics, in fact, who provided the basis for this. Everybody believed in the scala naturae, that is the ladder of nature, what we call the great chain of being. And this was a Neoplatonic notion. Neoplatonism just suffused the mind of Europe, even without almost nothing of Plato directly. We had this worldview which gobbled up Aristotelianism. So it's very hard to separate Aristotelianism from the Neoplatonism. This notion that the larger world and the little world of humanity, that they're mirrors of each other, the macrocosm and the microcosm. We have this ladder that includes God, humanity, nature, and everything is connected. One thing speaks of another. There's an analogical plenum, that there's a fullness of meaning in these levels of being. And so even the early modern scientists, they're looking for connections. They believe in magia naturalis, in what we call natural magic. They believe this in astrology. So we don't want to forget that the progenitors of the scientific revolution, they were medieval in many real ways, and also modern. There's a transition point here. So this analogical world where there's correspondences everywhere, that's very poetic. So that you have Bacon, who writes this utopian novel, The New Atlantis, which is our selection in 1626. Well, that's because to be a scientist and to be literary, that wasn't going to be opposed. And it was sapiential, that is, it was a wisdom tradition. They still looked for, to place what we call scientific facts within a larger whole. And it's something we've lost. Our scientific discourse is not the same. And that's why I want us to think about that question, because in our world, it still seems to me that the prestige discourse is science. So is it problematic to regard science as the master discourse? Is there any loss there? I mean, there's certain gains, because at least in a world of warring tribes, at least we can point to that. But is there something about the current scientific worldview that may be limiting, that has lost some of the things from its own beginnings in the scientific revolution? Not as poetic, not as sapiential. It doesn't look at the world as a system, as part of maybe asking open questions about God, humanity, and nature as being part of one system. Anyway, it's a question, because if we want to have a prestige discourse, a master discourse, maybe it needs to be something that's not dogmatically closed. And we've seen in history how bad it can be to be closed. In any case, as we come to an end here, we want to look at, just briefly, when Bacon, he is doing something that does transition to the modern world. He's rejecting the Aristotelian scholastic emphasis on causal knowledge. That is, Aristotle maintained that you needed to know four causes to define a thing, to understand a thing. That is, what is it made out of, material cause, what made it, the efficient cause, what's its intelligible form, its formal cause, and then what's it for, how does it fit into the big scheme of things, and that's the final cause. Final causality is the one that Bacon is most at war with, and which modern science is most at war with. But that's the thing that fits the individual fact into a larger context. And we can think of modern ecological thinking as a way of trying to recover this insertion into a whole. That is, how does our action in one place fit into a system of interaction? In any case, Bacon is one of the most important progenitors of the scientific method. He advocates, and we see this in The New Atlantis, which is a utopian novel set in on an island in the Pacific Ocean, so very much the background of the voyages of discovery is right there. He feels how that's important for opening up new worlds. Well, in this island, there's this cooperative venture to expand human understanding. And it's centered on a place called Solomon's house, which is interesting because, of course, Solomon is an exemplar, is the exemplar scripturally of wisdom. So even Bacon, so much the modern amongst these early moderns, well, he still wants to hold on to this wisdom tradition in some way. And in fact, the island of Ben Salem, which is the utopian world that is described in The New Atlantis, well, that's a Christian society. It's an interesting setup, and how they're evangelized is very interesting. But it is, and that's something else we have to take seriously. But on that island, you see exemplified the elements of the scientific method that Bacon is advocating. Collection of data, including through just observation of what's there, but also through experimentation, where you're setting up ways of trying to understand the movement of things into what he calls natural histories. From these natural histories, these massive collections of data, we induce, through induction, universal principles. And based on these universal principles, we want to be productive. We want to relieve man's estate. So that's the process. What he's left out, maybe, not as much emphasis on hypothesis, and not as much emphasis on mathematization, which you'll forget with Descartes. But nevertheless, Bacon is one of the most important sources for the world that we live in, because he is one of the great geniuses of the scientific revolution. And so we want to ask ourselves, if this world that Francis Bacon was so crucial for forming, if we feel as if we've lost connection to each other, to the wider whole, to in a world where we're ecologically sensitive, have we lost our way? Or are we just too interested in what power can do and not in what we should do? With the primacy of the practical, is there something about the primacy of the ethical that we need to recover? Well, that's something we can only do in a way that scientists, for instance, will hear us if we can all come together, look at the texts that are at the basis of this revolution, and see if we can find things that might open up a more humane way to become scientific.